Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Coexisting with Large Carnivores, Challenges and Solutions, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Aaron Bott. Aaron is a wildlife biologist and doctoral student at Utah State University, where he studies wolves across the American West to help promote coexistence between humans and carnivores. With deep roots in the Mountain West dating back to the mid-1800s, Aaron brings the expertise of a scientist and the intimate knowledge of a true local to his guiding. He spent over 15 years as a naturalist and wilderness guide throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Colorado Plateau. Aaron, we're grateful to you for being here today. Please, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm very grateful that you would spend time with me today on a Wednesday. Here in the West, we were just talking about a storm that's been rolling through, and we're getting snow up in the mountains and in some of those higher valleys for the first time this year. And it's a bit of a cozy day where I'm at. So wherever you're tuning in from, I hope that you're also enjoying yourself. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the conflicts and possible solutions from coexisting with large carnivores in the modern world in the 21st century. As I was so generously introduced, I'm a large carnivore biologist. I specialize in working with wolves. And so this is a presentation that I have thought a lot about, and I've given a few other presentations for Natural Habitat Adventures in the past on large carnivore biology, specifically related to wolves and grizzly bears and mountain lions and black bears. But I've also given a couple of presentations before regarding non-lethal coexistence solutions of how to raise livestock with large carnivores on the landscape. I've also talked about some of the challenges presented by having large carnivores return to landscapes where they've been absent for a very long period of time. And today's presentation is going to kind of synthesize all of that information. Before we get into it, I should forewarn you that this presentation is not overly graphic, However, it does have some photographs of dead animals in it, livestock in particular. And I guess I should have forewarned you earlier, because my lead slide here shows a picture of a calf that was killed by a wolf. This is a picture of me going out to do one of the investigations on dead livestock to determine the cause of death. It's a long and complex process where we do a necropsy to determine how the animal died and if large carnivores, specifically in this case wolves, were responsible for the demise of that animal. We'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that process later on. But yeah, just as a heads up, there are some pictures of dead livestock in particular in this presentation. Again, not anything terribly graphic. Well, without further ado, yeah, I'm a wolf biologist. I work with large carnivores, and I've spent my whole life working with and around large carnivores. I grew up in the Intermountain West, just outside of Yellowstone National Parks, where I spent most of my childhood. And we had grizzly bears and black bears, and eventually wolves were returned to the landscape in the 1990s. And I have family and friends who raise livestock. I had the opportunity to grow up, again, in a fairly rural setting, working on ranches and working on farms. And large carnivores were stressful and still are stressful for a lot of people in some of these large landscapes where large carnivores are still existing, still surviving, or are recovering in abundance. And in addition to large carnivores recovering on the landscape, the human dynamic is changing on some of these landscapes too. The human population is growing, and there's a lot of hyper-urbanization taking place, habitat fragmentation taking place on some of these landscapes. More and more people are moving into areas that have hitherto been unsettled, unestablished settlements have been in the area, and yeah, the landscape's changing, and so the social atmosphere is also changing. As a wildlife biologist, as a wolf biologist, I have what is often what I would say the best job in the world. I get to spend all the time working outside. I'm based out of a truck. I travel all across some rugged, beautiful Western landscapes, studying wildlife populations. Some of the highlights of my job involve actually handling the wildlife that I study. In this picture, I'm processing a female wolf, which I recently captured and then anesthetized. I'm taking body measurements from her. We're fitting her with a radio collar. And it's pretty exciting stuff to get into such an intimate position with wildlife and then watch as the animals recover from their drugs and walk off into the wild, and then be able to study them and monitor their populations and to discover things about their biology and the way they live that no one had ever understood or appreciated before. So in many ways, it's an incredibly exciting job. It is the best job, I would say. But for those who are interested in working with wildlife, it's important to realize that most of your time that you spend as a wildlife biologist is not actually working with animals. Most of your time and energy, and where all of the stress comes from, is working with humans that are engaged with animals in one way or another. It's kind of a joke that we often say to upcoming students and potential career employees who are interested in working with wildlife, that if you're thinking that you're going to spend your time working and managing wildlife, you're wrong. You're mostly going to be managing humans. And that is a very stressful and very accurate description of my job. I work a lot with people with various opinions and various attitudes towards wildlife. And that inevitably can be very complex. It can be very stressful. There's a lot of emotions there, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. And as a biologist who wants to study animals and spend as much time away from people as possible, the ugly reality is that I spend quite a lot of time talking to people. I'm on the phone constantly on holidays and on weekends trying to communicate and help people understand the importance of having wildlife on the landscape, particularly large carnivores, while also trying to figure out how we can practically move forward in a progressive manner with recovering large carnivore populations, as well as having human expansion and land development and habitat loss on the landscape. This is a beautiful photograph taken by my friend Ronan Donovan, and I've shared it in a number of my slides. It's one of my favorite slides to include on many of my presentations related to large carnivores. I love how this beautiful wolf, which this photograph is taken up in northeastern Yellowstone National Park. I love how this wolf is slightly out of focus. I think that it is a pretty good visual representation of how we as humans often have large carnivores out of focus when we are getting worked up about them or emotional about them or telling stories about them. The animal's clearly present, but we're focused more on our own narratives, and we're focused more on our own stories that we like to tell ourselves rather than the biological entity, which is the wolf itself. And this is a beautiful quote from the renowned and late biologist Aldo Leopold from the early 1900s. He said that only the mountain has lived long enough to listen objectively to the howl of the wolf. And I love that quote because I think he's dead on. Humans are unique for a lot of things, but I think what makes us particularly unique is our love of storytelling. We love stories. Humans like to try and solve problems, and we do it by telling stories. And the stories we tell ourselves are ultimately the stories that we believe. We like to think that we are interested in facts and quantitative data and numbers, but that's not the truth. The truth is that we really just like to tell stories. And even as a biologist, trying to be as objective as possible when I'm studying the wolf, I can't deny the reality, which is that wolves are charismatic and interesting to me on a personal level, on a storytelling level, on a mythical level, in addition to all of the other fascinating objective truths about the species. So that's going to be an important motif of our presentation today, is that humans tell stories, and ultimately the facts often don't always jive with the stories that we tell ourselves, but those stories nevertheless have a lot of sway, and they ultimately determine how we decide to coexist with the natural world. Particularly with large carnivores, humans are fascinated because we like monsters. And this shouldn't be any surprise, because we humans are another animal on the planet. And for tens of thousands of years, we were not at the top of the food chain. We evolved and coexisted with a very dynamic and sometimes threatening world. Large carnivores were our competitors as we emerged in Africa and then dispersed across the entire globe. And some of this deep-rooted psychological roots, I guess, take place with our historical coexistence with these large carnivores. And even today, as many of us are aware, very few humans in the modern world, in the North American world, are ever going to encounter large carnivores. We live in urban settings, we live in large cities, large carnivore populations are very much diminished, and now our greatest threats often come from vehicle collisions or from overeating and diseases associated with abundance of resources rather than an existential threat from an animal. Nevertheless, we still like telling stories about big, bad, monstrous animals like Jaws and other films, which are very popular and often not at all accurate about humans and our real threats from wildlife and from large carnivores. But we still like to tell these stories. They're fascinating. And because of that, large carnivores are always in the limelight of the news. I love this illustration here. This poor guy doesn't have a prayer, and it's really an hysterical overrepresentation of many realities. But this is, again, just kind of a symbol of the storytelling that we as humans tend to tell ourselves, the facts versus the fiction. And we're going to get into just the details of the facts and the fiction just here for a second, talking again about large carnivores. This is our home, planet Earth, and on planet Earth, we have carnivores, animals that have evolved to eat and ingest and digest meat. We have the mammalian order, Carnivora, which includes your bears, your lions, your cats, your dogs, your wolves. But we also have other carnivores on the planet, although they don't fall under the order Carnivora. Some of your reptiles and your fish, like your great white shark, animals that have evolved to, again, ingest and digest meat. All animals have to consume something in order to survive. We all need to ingest calories in one form or another, and to digest meat is a very efficient way of gaining nutrients. And so there are a lot of carnivores across the globe, including ourselves, humans, who are omnivores, but we definitely consume a lot of meat, again, because it's readily digestible and you can extract a lot of nutrients from meat. But all across the globe, we share this planet with other large carnivores in various capacities on all continents and in all oceans. And as I just stated, carnivores must kill and eat other animals in order to survive. Whether you're a grizzly bear, a mountain lion, or a wolf, carnivores are going to be killing things in order to make a living. That's how they evolved, and that's how their biology works. And this leads to conflicts with humans because humans also depend upon other living animals in order to live and survive. And something that we have inherited over the last 10,000 years is livestock husbandry, or this ability to domesticate animals and raise them as our own property, so that we can harvest meat and we can gain sustenance, and we can also have economic drivers associated with livestock husbandry and agrarian production. Excuse me. But when large carnivores threaten our resources, then this creates tension, emotional stress at the very least. This is a 8-month-old steer, which was recently killed by a pair of wolves. I went out last week to look at this and confirm it. And as you can see, it was in an enclosed pasture, a pretty frustrating situation for the producer there. Now, humans evolved as an animal on the species, as an animal on the planet. And for tens of thousands of years, like I said, we coexisted with the natural world and struggled as one species among many to survive and to make a living and to reproduce. But about 10 to 11,000 years ago, humans began to practice agriculture. We began to practice plant domestication and then animal domestication, which changed everything. It changed our relationship with the natural world forever. And the first animals outside of the wolf to be domesticated, the first animals domesticated were sheep and goats about 11,000 years ago. And then we had cows and horses and pigs and chickens and other animals that were ultimately domesticated. And as humans began to practice livestock husbandry, again, our own survival and our own economic stability began to shift from the natural world, hunting and gathering, to our agrarian practices and protecting our livestock. And this, of course, shifted our relationship with large carnivores, which take advantage of domestic livestock. They don't see them necessarily as a taboo resource on the landscape. And so humans, for a very long time, since the agricultural revolution, relationship with large carnivores. And as livestock husbandry in particular spread across the globe, humans' relationships, regardless of where they're at or their culture, again, increased rates of tension with these large carnivores. And many large carnivores suffered because of that. But it's, again, important to realize that domestication is a process that humans have basically taken advantage of through artificial selection. So all of our domestic animals today had wild ancestors, a variation of different species, which once roamed or might even still roam in the wilds today. This is an illustration of an auroch, which is the ancestor to all existing cattle today. There are 3 different species of auroch found in Eurasia. The last wild auroch went extinct in the 1600s, but it was from this wild ox that roamed across 3 different continents, including North Africa, that all of our cattle are descended from today. Again, there's a lot of differences due to artificial selection and inbreeding and crossbreeding with domestic livestock today, which has altered the morphology of many of these domestic animals which we depend upon. But all of their ancestors hailed from the wilds, and large carnivores like bears and lions and wolves would have preyed upon these wild animals for tens of thousands of years. And again, this is just to emphasize that large carnivores are dynamic and they're capable of eating various species. All they care about is getting enough nutrients in order for them to survive, to meet their basic biological requirements. But when a wolf kills and eats something like a bison, a wild bison, we call this as humans predation, where the predator has killed its prey, it is consuming its prey, and that is what we expect because it's the natural process and life history of this animal to go out on the landscape and to hunt and collect meat for itself. But when the same wolf goes out and kills something that is domestic, like cattle, we call this depredation, which is destroying private property or the loss of private property. And the wolf, of course, doesn't understand that there's a difference here, killing the bison versus killing the cow. A wolf generation is about 3 years, and so for many, many generations, wolves have lived on the landscape with both cattle and wild prey like elk and bison and deer. And it doesn't necessarily recognize that one resource is taboo socially and the other one is a bit more tolerated. But we humans place these values on things that we own. And it's the depredation or the property damage which causes the most anxiety and trouble. And so again, as humans adopted livestock husbandry, and as this practice spread across the globe, humans began to target large carnivores for eradication. I've mentioned this before, but one of my favorite books is Gilgamesh, which is one of the earliest forms of literature, one of the earliest texts of literature that we have. The story is probably 4,000 years old at least. And in the story, the wild man Enkidu is petitioned by the shepherds to go out and protect their sheep from the wolves at night. This is, again, a story that's 4,000 years old, and it already is illustrating this age-old conflict between livestock and wild predators or carnivores on the landscape. The first known documented bounty on wolves was recorded in the 6th century BCE in ancient Greece. And wolves historically once ranged all across the northern hemisphere, but were systematically eradicated from many parts of their historical range in Greece and in Italy and in the British Isles and in Scandinavia and in Asia and in Japan over many centuries. And then as Europeans began to colonize North America and brought livestock husbandry practices with them here to North America, predator eradication programs by this point in time had become very efficient, especially with the advent of using poison to try and eradicate large carnivores. And so at the end of the 1800s, but really the first part of the 1900s, government programs, both federal and local, worked very hard to remove as many large carnivores from the landscape as possible. And we were very effective and efficient at removing large carnivores. But again, this is just it's not a Wild Western story. It's not a North American specific narrative. Large carnivore eradication programs have been underway for centuries, for thousands of years on every continent. So it's not just, again, a North American narrative, although many of us, I assume today, are probably tuning in from the United States. But specifically with the United States, in the mid-1990s, we began to reintroduce wolves to parts of their historical range after having eradicated them from most of the lower 48 states. And I'm highlighting this particular event because it was the first event where humans were trying to help reestablish large carnivore populations into areas where they had been eradicated. So the wolf reintroduction of 1995 and 1996 was the first of its kind anywhere. Since then, we've practiced large carnivore reintroductions into other places on the globe, but this was really the first kind of experiment. We weren't exactly sure if it would work, but the whole story behind this, which I'm grossly oversimplifying right here, is that after wolves and grizzly bears and mountain lions had been eradicated from most of their historical range in the lower 48 states, scientists as well as the public began to realize that decision to eradicate large carnivores and other wildlife species from their historical range was not ethical, and it was probably going to have negative repercussions biologically as well. And so in the 1990s, again, kind of to spearhead large carnivore recovery efforts, wolves, a total of 66 in 2 years, were captured in Canada and released into central Idaho and into Yellowstone National Park. And again, this is an exciting moment in history because it's the first of its kind, really, all across the globe. But since this reintroduction in the mid-1990s, other large carnivore recovery efforts have been underway in other places across the globe. This is a map by National Geographic, which I really liked, but it shows the approximate location of where wolves historically ranged in North America, as well as where they currently ranged. And that blue dashed line that you can see up in Alaska and then all through Canada is basically the boundary of where predator eradication programs were at. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, all the way into Canada, all throughout the lower 48 states and into parts of Alaska, wolves were systematically eradicated. Fortunately, wolves are very prolific, and thanks to recovery efforts like the Northern Rocky Mountain Recovery Program, which took place in the 1990s, wolves have been recovering on the landscape. But still, you can see that a lot of their historical range is still unoccupied by wolves, and they've lost a lot of their historical range. And this is just a picture of North America itself. It's very similar in Europe and Asia as well. They've lost a lot of historical range, and they're most likely not going to get it all back. We'll talk about why in just a little bit. Similarly, grizzly bears used to live essentially everywhere to the west of the Mississippi River, but they were systematically eradicated, and this map shows their historical range in that light gray and their current distribution. And mountain lions as well. They used to range from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This is a great map put out by Patagonia showing their current distribution and how they are seemingly starting to recolonize parts of their historical range, these very elusive large cats. In fact, cougars or mountain lions are the only large cat species on the planet which actually has a growing population, whereas all the others are diminishing in number. So pretty exciting there. But as mountain lions are recovering in parts of their former range, it is it begs the question of how humans will adapt to coexisting with these animals, which are adaptive and dynamic on the landscape. And here is a picture of the current distribution of black bears across North America. I'm showing again these illustrations of map distribution of large carnivores because one of the first things that we can do when it comes to gaining tolerance and appreciation and understanding and improving coexistence with large carnivores is to first understand where these animals are and trying to figure out whether or not they're in our backyards, and if they are in our backyards, how can we better coexist with them. Gaining a more in-depth appreciation of the wildlife in your neighborhood, in your backyard, is the first step to improving coexistence with the natural world. Here's a photograph of a map from Europe. Wolves in Europe over the last 2 decades have also been rebounding through mostly natural recolonization, as diminished wolf populations have slowly been recovering due to protective status. You can now see that wolves are more abundant in Scandinavia and in parts of Italy and Spain and Portugal and down through Greece. and in through Germany and Denmark. It's pretty remarkable how wolves are recovering in Europe, but the European landscape is very different from North America. You have twice as many people in Europe as you do in the United States, and you have half of the land mass. And you also have twice as many wolves in Europe as you do in the lower 48 states. So trying to figure out how to coexist with large carnivores on very little land and very few native prey species that are still roaming around wild is a stressful challenge. And even here, home in the United States, we often see these kind of reports in the news. Coyotes running through neighborhoods, killing cats, mountain lions being spotted on doorbell cameras, a bear occasionally wandering through the public park in an urban area. And these kind of news reports always captivate the public because they're fascinated by animals. And also there's this thrill of, oh my gosh, wild animals are still present on the landscape. And what are they doing here? And is my cat going to get eaten? And are my kids safe? And am I safe? The more human development we have, in addition to expanding large carnivore populations, the more overlap we're going to have. And this kind of coexistence, it can be very stressful. Coexistence, not necessarily in the harmonious meaning of the word, but just having to overlap and coexist with wildlife can be stressful, and it increases conflicts. This is a picture of a bear, which is comical, but it's also not okay to have large carnivores or other wildlife living off of human refuse or in urban areas where they're bound to become habituated and food conditioned to resources which are problematic and can cause, again, depredation or property damage. And ultimately, the animal could either get sick by ingesting things that it shouldn't be ingesting, or more likely, that animal is going to end up dead by becoming a threat to humans from becoming habituated or from actually harming humans. This is a very stressful situation for wildlife biologists and managers, is seeing animals like this in urban settings while recognizing that the animals historically were there first. So as a biologist, again, one of the primary objectives of my career is to collect enough data and science to improve our storytelling, to understand how these animals live and what they depend upon so that we can better protect their habitat and their resources. If we don't have data, if we don't collect information on these species, if we don't have better science to improve our storytelling, then human tolerance for wolves or any wildlife is going to be less and less likely. So that's the primary objective of being a scientist, is understanding how they hunt and how they live on the landscape. Specifically with wolves, and I mean really any large carnivore, when it comes to predation or how they hunt and how they kill animals, everything really boils down to the abundance and the vulnerability of the prey accessible to carnivores on the landscape. Abundance is a key component of reducing conflict with livestock and with people, especially in Europe, where many of the wild prey populations are extinct or vanished or greatly diminished. These large carnivores, which are dynamic and adaptive and flexible, are going to shift their predation patterns away from wildlife, and they're going to be looking to get food from, again, dare I say, inappropriate sources such as livestock or domestic dogs, cats, or garbage dumps. So it's crucial for us to understand that if you care about large carnivores, you really need to care about their prey source in order to keep those predator populations healthy and out of trouble. And inevitably, as a biologist, I spend more time with livestock than I do wildlife, just like I spend more time with humans than I do with wildlife. I collect data in order to understand and appreciate wildlife like wolves, but I also do this in order to better understand how we can better manage our livestock and our own species in order to reduce conflicts with these large carnivores. I can't send out a memo to wolves to tell them that eating livestock is bad and it's going to get them into trouble. But I can study wolves and then work with livestock producers or city developers and planners to try and make recommendations that will hopefully change our behavior and our behavioral patterns to reduce conflicts. And this, in some cases, means practicing innovative ideas or even traditional ideas which have gone out of fashion, such as putting up fladry or temporary electric fencing around pastures, monitoring the health of your domestic livestock to ensure that they are not vulnerable, but they're going to be healthy and strong. And again, this is just a dovetailing of the science with the social consequences of having large carnivores on the landscape. So we recognize that because animals like wolves are particularly flexible and they can live on just about anything as long as it's got protein, we have ecological predictors which are going to determine where large carnivores are on the landscape, such as elk density, elk population abundance. But we also have to take into consideration social predictors, such as human land use and livestock land use. And how these different predictors collide is going to determine the biological and the social carrying capacities of large carnivores. This is something that's really important to touch on because, again, most large carnivores are very adaptive. They're very flexible in how they live. The coyote is like the prime example of this. Coyotes are a mesocarnivore, a middle-sized carnivore, which is successfully surviving on a very human-dominated landscape because as a medium-sized carnivore, they're sneaky and they are very happy not just eating rabbits and squirrels and scavenging on deer carcasses out in the woods as they evolved to do, but they're equally happy to run at night through neighborhoods in urban areas where they can eat dog food, where they can compete with raccoons and kill cats or chickens or even dogs, and run through garbage dumps and scavenge off of enough human refuse for them to make an easy living. The coyote doesn't care. The coyote's going to get its calories. It's going to get its protein either way. But one is more socially tolerable than the other. We humans want our wildlife to live wild, but the reality is that our wild spaces are shrinking, and as they're shrinking, carnivores are having to adapt to a more human-dominated landscape, a more semi-urban landscape. And this means that we have social limitations for our tolerance of having large carnivores surviving in our backyards. I've spent my whole life around large carnivores, and I really love carnivores. I find them fascinating. But I draw the line at having a grizzly bear in the park across the street where my kids play. That's not socially acceptable to me. That's a place where that bear is probably going to get into trouble, and it might even harm someone or kill someone. So we have social limitations to our tolerance, and there's places, again, where we accept carnivores on the landscape and places where we don't. And we have to ask ourselves, as humans are continually developing the landscape and fragmenting habitats, like, where are these places going to be? And not all habitats, not all wild spaces are created equally. Here's 3 different photographs taken from Oregon, actually, where Oregon, like many large Western states, has a high variety of topographical diversity. You're not going to have a lot of elk running through the Great Basin Desert there on the right-hand side of the picture, nor are you going to have a lot of them on the western slopes of the Cascades, where it's just a jungle and there's not a lot of forage for them. So even some of our wild spaces just are not suitable for large carnivores or for their prey, because the wolves need elk, for example. And so if there's no elk out in the Great Basin Desert, then you're not going to expect to have a lot of wolves out in the Great Basin Desert. And it's those sweet spots, those wild spots, not just an absence of humans, but the quality of the habitat, which ultimately is going to drive where these animals can be. And of course, with urban development, hyper-urban development, we have larger and larger cities, a greater and greater sized human footprint on the landscape, which is going to determine where animals can and cannot be. This area is an ecological dead zone for elk and for wolves and for grizzly bears. What once was probably pristine habitat is no longer suitable habitat for these large animals. And so that dictates, again, their range and expansion. Now this ties in with rural communities and the stresses that come from having to coexist with large carnivores. In the American West, natural land is being, or wild land is being developed by humans at an acre every 2.5 minutes. So right now, human expansion and habitat loss is one of the greatest, if not the greatest threat to wildlife distribution and biodiversity. And this puts a lot of pressure on rural communities, which are also strapped for resources and time and money, and have to coexist or are expected to coexist with wildlife, while also facing the threat of losing their operations to competing interests, such as mega livestock husbandry practices, such as industrial scaled beef farms out in the Midwest and dairy farms out in the Midwest. So this kind of pressure, economic and social, is very challenging. As humans, again, develop these areas, it causes more stress for wildlife and more stress on wildlife spaces. And as more people develop and take up wildlife habitat, again, more overlap. And with large carnivores, in some cases, this can be potentially fatal and very stressful. And the tolerance for large carnivores is really put to the test. And so we have to ask ourselves, as we go out into the woods, as we recreate, what level of risk are we okay with? Should we be mountain biking in wildlife habitat, in grizzly bear habitat, in elk habitat, in wolf habitat? Should I be trail running? Like, what level of, to what extent are we willing to extend our own recreational objectives for our own pleasure at the expense of biodiversity? And of course, again, going back to the age-old gladiatorial combat between livestock and large carnivores, this is an ugly issue which is never going away. As long as large carnivores eat meat, which they will always eat meat, we will continue to have problems with large carnivores attacking and killing livestock, which again is very, very emotionally challenging for a lot of people who have been working to raise their animals and are dependent upon that resource for their own economic stability. Animals like like wolves, they are inevitably going to encounter livestock on the landscape. And when they do attack and injure livestock, it's not pretty and it's very challenging. But this inevitability, again, goes back to the abundance of resources for these carnivores on the landscape. This is just a quick count of specifically the state of Oregon, their abundance of cattle versus the number of elk in the state. It's just a numbers game, right? You have 1.2 million cattle across the Oregonian landscape, and you have 130,000 elk. Of course, predators like wolves are going to be killing cattle. That's just the way of things. We have a tremendous footprint, even in some of the more wild areas of the country. And we can't be naive in assuming that large carnivores are going to find places to live where they're not encountering humans to some degree or another. This also goes back to translocation or relocation of large carnivores when they become problematic. I get asked this all the time by the public. If we have an animal like a bear, which has become habituated to living in areas where people have been dumping out garbage for the animal, or they're getting into garden beds, people say, why can't you just relocate that animal? Do you have to euthanize the animal every time? And the answer is no, we can't relocate these animals because we don't have enough wild space left on the landscape for them to not come and get back into trouble in many cases. The largest wilderness area that we have in the lower 48 states, the biggest divide or distance between a road and a wilderness area is in the thoroughfare of Yellowstone National Park. And you're looking at 20, 30 miles away from the nearest road, which an animal like a bear can walk in a single day. So we don't have places where we can just pick up animals and move them around and drop them off into other more rural, more wooded wildlands, because those wildlands inevitably are going to intersect with human interest to some degree. And as we have more conflicts, we of course have an erosion of tolerance. And again, those social components, those social values are ultimately what drive large carnivore persistence and biodiversity on the landscape. And so we have more poaching, more illegal killing of animals, large carnivores in particular, because of that lack of social tolerance. So how do we move forward? What do we do about this? Well, again, I started out by telling you that most of my job is focused on having hard conversations with humans. I'm a wolf biologist, but I spend most of my day talking to people about wolves and talking to people about large carnivores and what they can do to reduce conflicts with large carnivores, how we can better share the landscape. And this is challenging because people have, again, very deep emotional connections to these topics, whether they are passionate advocates for wolves and large carnivores and wild spaces, or they're passionate recreators who really want to have their mountain biking trails improved and expanded, or whether they're hunters and they've been hunting elk and deer in that area for generations and now feel like things are changing with an added large carnivore component to the system, or whether they're ranchers and they're stressed because frankly there's more cows on the landscape than there are deer and elk, and so large carnivores are threatening and causing problems to their livestock. These are conversations which are constant and ongoing and very stressful, and there's not a silver bullet. There's nothing that is ultimately going to resolve these issues other than having the ability to listen with patience and compassion and try and recognize where the other person is coming from and trying to find, in many cases, the best compromise possible. I'm just going to wrap up here. I've got a couple more slides, but I'm running out of time. This slide just illustrates how wildlife is managed in the United States. Every state has its own wildlife agency, and the agency conducts science and research to monitor its wildlife populations. And the Wildlife Agency then presents this data, these findings, and these recommendations to appointed representatives, people who are appointed by the governor to basically listen to what the wildlife experts have to say and then make decisions about how wildlife should be managed and how we can best juggle these human-wildlife interface conflicts. Or we have, in other situations, legislatures which can make decisions and put things into law or change policy, which then instructs wildlife agency personnel how they should be managing or not managing wildlife species. Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but just recognize that you as a citizen, you have some involvement, some invested involvement in managing wildlife, at least here in the United States. And you can participate in some of these ongoing discussions and conversations about how wildlife is managed by following your local wildlife agency and reaching out to them, or by becoming more involved politically. Large carnivores are essential to healthy and complex ecosystems. They evolved as one of the vital components of the ecosystem. But it's also important to realize that humans are ultimately the top dog when it comes to influencing ecosystems. We influence large carnivores, which also indirectly influence their prey, which influences the habitat and the vegetation. We are at the top of the food chain. Even if we're not directly killing large carnivores, our actions are manipulating how they can live and where they can live on the landscape. And as a biologist, this is the ultimate question, which I'm constantly wrestling with, which is what are the limitations to recovery? We're definitely moving in the right direction with large carnivore restoration programs and recovery programs all across the country. Things are better now than they were 50 years ago as far as carnivore distribution and biodiversity goes with large carnivores in mind. But we still have a long way to go. And it's also important to realize that there are limitations to what recovery might look like. There are places now where we used to have large carnivores where we simply can't have them anymore because there's just been too much human disturbance of the landscape. But there are also places that could have large carnivores and they could support higher biodiversity. And how do we navigate that system of triage, and how do we figure out how to best work together and communicate in order to protect wild species, wild places, and promote biodiversity is a tricky thing. This is my last slide. This is my friend David Andrews and we went out to put up some temporary fladry, some fencing around some corrals where livestock are going to be kept in order to keep the wolves away. There's a lot of tools out there that can be used to mitigate conflicts between livestock and large carnivores, but ultimately it's your attitude and it's your ability to adapt and understand the natural world which is going to influence the greatest variable of success when it comes to coexisting with large carnivores and dealing with these challenges. And frankly, it's having some empathy and it's having some compassion and understanding where people are coming from in order to try and improve the situation and to help people feel heard and empowered and trying to resolve those issues. If we can stop alienating one another, if we can stop pointing the finger and instead looking to ourselves and trying to figure out what we're doing and what we could do better, those are the things that are ultimately going to improve our ability to reduce conflicts with large carnivores. And that is it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Aaron. All right, so before we dive into the questions, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So Aaron, with the reintroduction of wolves into Colorado, how is the livestock industry adapting to this? Are they willing to, and is it working okay for now?
That's a good question, and it really depends upon the person being impacted, right? So there's a massive learning curve that comes with reintroducing large carnivores to an area where they've been absent. It's a learning curve, obviously, for the people who now have to deal with a challenge that they haven't had to deal with for 70 or 80 years. But it's also a challenge for livestock. The livestock have to adjust behaviorally to having another stressor on the landscape. And it really is challenging because of the bandwidth that some ranchers or producers may or may not have when it comes to dealing with suddenly another variable of conflict on the landscape. Ranchers are very often stressed about other things like drought and food prices, hay prices, and it's challenging sometimes to get people the right information that they need in order to best coexist with large carnivores. And unfortunately, even though we work really hard to be proactive and to work with people and educate people and give them the tools that they need to prevent conflicts from happening, it's just human nature for many of us to not take things seriously until we start having specific conflicts. And so a lot of it does become reactive. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a long uphill battle, and I guess it's job security. But as Colorado has been reintroducing wolves, they are navigating the same challenges that everyone else who has to live with wolves deals with. A lot of that comes down to getting the right resources and the right information distributed to those who are most impacted.
Are there any type of reimbursement programs for ranchers who do lose livestock through state or even federal government?
Yeah, so all states in the West have reimbursement programs, compensation programs for when livestock are injured or killed by wolves. That's one of the reasons why I go out to look at injured or dead livestock to determine whether or not, as a professional, as a specialist, I look at it and I conduct a necropsy to determine if wolves were involved in that depredation event. And if wolves were involved, then that producer can receive compensation, monetary compensation. Now, this doesn't apply to all carnivores. It does apply to like grizzly bears and wolves in most of those states where the two species are extant. But in other places, it's just wolves that compensation is applied for.
Great, thank you for that answer. Are there in Montana and Idaho? Are they trying to eradicate wolves there? Is that something, or is
Yeah,
that
they're not trying to eradicate them, but they are trying to reduce them. So that's kind of one of those human valued problems, complexities, where Idaho and Montana have a lot of wolves. They have a lot of wolves, and the population has been recovered, meaning it was removed from the endangered species list back in 2011, and the wolf population has grown. Um, and even though the states there have been hunting and trapping wolves for the last 15 years or whatever, 14 years, the populations have still grown despite hunting and trapping. And so in 2021, both Idaho and Montana's legislatures decided to liberalize wolf harvest, the hunting and trapping methods, in order to try and bring the population down, to encourage the public to remove more wolves and bring the population down. The goal is not to eradicate them, because that would not be allowed, but it is to reduce the number of wolves in both of those states. And I am concerned with how they're doing it, and I don't necessarily approve of it, but yeah, the goal is not to eradicate them, just to reduce them.
Thank you for explaining that to us. We appreciate it. In California, there was a bear that apparently moved into a crawl space under a house. How does that get dealt with?
Well, we get phone calls to go, especially like in, semi-urban areas or suburban areas where people have cabins and whatnot. Bears will break into cabins all the time, and typically what we do is, if there's a bear in a crawl space under a house, we go in and we crawl under the house where the bear is, and we dart it with a needle to anesthetize the animal. And then when the animal's asleep, we pull it out and we try and relocate it someplace else if possible. So a lot of variables are at play there. In some cases, if the bear is unhealthy, or if it's been way too habituated to people and is considered a threat to human safety, it might have to be euthanized. But if it's just a bear that is in a place it shouldn't be, then we anesthetize it and then we try and relocate it someplace else, away from humans.
And what happens if it returns to the place, say it was released 10, 20 miles away?
If it returns, then, I mean, I'm assuming that they may have radio collared the bear just to monitor it. That's often what we'll do to see if it's going to continue to cause problems. And it really just depends upon, again, the human environment and the potential damage or threat that the animal can cause to human life. If it becomes a repeated offender, then it will probably be euthanized. And if they can catch it again and relocate it a different time, then they'll continue to do that as long as it seems possible to rewire that bear's brain and get it to not go back.
Great. Well, thank you, Aaron. Unfortunately, it is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Large carnivores are fascinating, and they truly make the world a better place, but they also make the world a more challenging place. And dealing with some of these conflicts is very important, and it's something I would encourage all of you to think about with compassion and empathy, and try and figure out how we can better move forward by encouraging biodiversity on our landscape and in our backyards. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Aaron. We appreciate you talking to us about this really important subject. And I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. If you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and the replay will be available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. So long, everybody. We'll see you next time.